Stephanie Thornton is the clinical director for the West Virginia Judicial and Lawyer Assistance Program. She is an LICSW and a master addiction counselor focused on access to trauma and substance use disorder treatment to ensure the health and well-being of affected individuals. Stephanie earned a Master of Divinity degree from Emory University Candler School of Theology in the honors program and a Master of Social Work degree from the University of Georgia. She has been clinically licensed as a social worker and addictions counselor since 2004, and additionally holds certificates as a Certified Addiction Counselor Level 3, Certified Clinical Trauma Professional, and Certified Sex Offender Treatment Provider. Stephanie's clinical training background is in trauma, and she is on the Trauma Informed Care Network Speakers Bureau and presents on trauma, substance use, and self-care across the state and at national conferences. Stephanie is a West Virginia State Advisory Committee member to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, co-chair of the Courts and Criminal Justice Involved Populations Subcommittee to the Governor's Council on Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment, and is a board member on the West Virginia Board of Social Work. Stephanie also sits on other nonprofit boards, and we are so excited to have her today.
Thanks, Sarah. And just to kind of give a foundation, and I'm glad to be here too. But if you do have questions, please ask them in the chat. I know sometimes these topics, and this topic in particular, it will create a rabbit hole of thoughts and ideas. And so let's answer the questions as they're pertinent as they go along. So just put an asterisk in front of that question. We'll make sure that it gets highlighted. So as Sarah said, I'm a proud social worker, and this particular subject is something that has really bothered me, I'll be honest, for many, many years, because I remember reading a report that said West Virginia was 14th in the country for incarcerating women. And I started going down a rabbit hole of my own to try to figure out why that might be, because it doesn't make sense when we have a decreasing population that we would have such an increase in incarceration rates for women in particular. And I found that overall nationwide, and in West Virginia in particular, there has been an increase in incarceration rates for women. And so there's been a 700% increase in the past 30 years, and that's been an almost 3,000% increase in West Virginia over a 40-year period. When I first started looking at this question, I noticed that the nationwide numbers were profound, but then when you look at information on a state-by-state basis, there were a few states that always rose to the top. Idaho, Oklahoma, Kentucky was up there, and then West Virginia was, high up there as well. Well, in 2020, the last year that we have data for incarceration rates of women, Idaho was number one with 110 per 100,000 incarcerated women. Oklahoma had dropped to number two after having been number one for several years. And West Virginia was number 10 for incarceration rates of women, and that's 72 women per 100,000. Now, if we look at the United States as a whole, as a state, then the United States ended up being lower down on that list, incarcerating 47 women per 100,000. So with this in mind, framing our discussion today, we have to really consider what are the root issues that are bringing women into the criminal legal system, and what are the drivers for these women. And a qualifier here, when I talk about women and when I talk about girls, I'm talking about individuals that are identifying themselves as female or closely associating themselves with femaleness. That is not necessarily what's being studied in the record or in the data, but that's what I'm referring to. So this is a quote from Orange is the New Black. Piper Kerman wrote a book about her experience in federal prison. And you will have the slides so you can read this more in depth. But basically, she was in federal prison and she felt like it was her opportunity to get all of her medical care needs because the government was going to pay for it. And so she was really smug and she signed up for this opportunity to go see a gynecologist. And no one else in her dorm at the prison was going to see the gynecologist. And she was like, come on, get your money's worth, show up. And pretty soon she realized why no one else showed up. It's because she was stripped down to nothing but her sports bra. She was cold and freaked out. She should have at least had a robe. There should have at least been a piece of paper over the exam table. It hurt. It was horrible. And she said, when it was all over and the old man had gone, departed with a bang of the door, I was left clutching that paper sheet around me, feeling just like the prison system wanted me to, utterly powerless, vulnerable, and alone. And this is the context that many women are experiencing when they're going into prison. And that's because prisons are created and structurally created as places to hold men. And a lot of the prison systems are created for men. And so when you have a woman who is in a male-centric system, and that woman is vulnerable, she may be traumatized, she may have scarcity in her background, then she's being re-traumatized by that prison system. And when we think about prisons or we think about jails and how they control behavior, some of the things that they do include strip searches, putting women in isolation because of a behavior modification goal. And if you have a traumatized woman who's strip searched, you're just re-traumatizing her. If you have a woman who is vulnerable and scared and isolated, then putting her into solitary confinement, that's re-traumatizing her and making her more and more isolated. And so not only are we re-traumatizing women, but we also have women who are coming out of the community where they're the primary caregivers, primary breadwinners. They're the ones that have the housing. They're the ones that are taking care of their kids in the community. And we're extracting them from that and placing them into a system that doesn't allow them to meet the needs of their family, meet the needs of their community, and certainly they can't get back. Women have higher rates in prison of historical abuse, substance use, HIV, trauma, and then these are individuals that are also more often than not mothers, especially as we're going to see mothers of minor children. So there's something called the school to prison pipeline, and that is where we know if a girl in her childhood or adolescence is detained in juvenile detention, even for a school discipline related matter, then she's more likely to be incarcerated later on in life. And so we know that the majority of women in jails had been in jail pre-trial or have had a history of juvenile incarceration. And so that is not an accident. This is a cyclical problem where we are creating a pipeline of individuals whose behaviors, maybe trauma-based behaviors, are getting the attention of schools and getting them in trouble, and then they're ending up in juvenile detention, and that causes them to experience scarcity, that causes them to be involved with people that may be negatively influencing them, and that tends to lead them into the criminal legal system. Women overall are also lower wage earners, whether they're involved in the criminal legal system or not. In West Virginia, that's about 78 cents on the dollar for a woman earning 78 cents and a man earning $1. In individuals that have had some kind of criminal legal experience in their past, that causes them to make less money overall, and their ability to earn more money is creating havoc because these women have barriers to sustainable employment. They have legal barriers that can't allow them to be employed because they have some kind of criminal history in their background that keeps them from getting employed. And that means that they're going to continue to be low wage earners. Also, the majority of women in jails and prisons in jails specifically, are sentenced to misdemeanors. So these are crimes that are oftentimes property crimes. There's no victim. The victim is the state, or the victim is some kind of entity, not an individual. And the time that these individuals serve is 1 year or less. But for a mother, for a worker, for someone who's holding down the finances in their home or in their community, that 1 year is going to prevent them from keeping their children, is going to keep them from having their house, having employment, and is actually going to exacerbate problems getting employment in the future. Finally, harsher punishments exist for women of color, in particular Black women, and women who are lesbian or identifying as bisexual. So I've mentioned that the majority of women in jails and prisons are mothers, and that's about 80% of women in jails and 62% of women in prison. And they're mothers to minor children, so small children that really need their attention and need their mom to be with them. And there have been studies on this that have shown that mothers in particular are sentenced more harshly and held to higher standards than their male counterparts. So in one study in particular, there was a mother who was charged with a crime that did not involve abuse or neglect of her children. And then there was a man who also had children, and he was directly involved in a crime that was surrounding abuse and neglect of his kids. The mother was more likely to lose custody and have her parental rights terminated when she was charged with any crime, particularly crimes not involving her children, but any crime whatsoever. Whereas the man who was charged with harming his children was more likely to not lose or have his parental rights terminated. So we really do hold mothers to a higher standard. Women come into the incarceration system with a higher rate of sexual violence and sexual victimization, 30 times more likely to be incarcerated or be raped while incarcerated rather than free. And that is often because they've already been victimized on the outside, and they are coming into prison settings that are male-centric with a lot of male correctional officers, and that victimization continues and is perpetuated while they're incarcerated over and over again. In the federal women's prison, overall across the country, 70% of the staff are male. And so you're putting women into a setting where they're being monitored and overseen by someone that may have victimized them by sex in the past, by gender in the past, and then they're in that vulnerable situation again. When I worked in Georgia, I remember there was a children's prison, and it was for juveniles that were detained for a long period of time. And Georgia at that time allowed children to be charged as adults. And so these kids would go to this prison and they would be overseen by the correctional staff. And then when Georgia changed some of their legislative policies and changed their laws and allowed these children to be returned to different settings other than a prison because they were still kids, they decided that they were going to move women into that prison because they already had the structure set up. And when they moved the women into the prison, they didn't change any of the correctional staff. And so the correctional staff who had been physically and sexually abusive to the children ended up being physically and sexually abusive to the women because there was no kind of training, no kind of transition, no kind of reorientation for the correctional staff at that prison to shift who they were supervising and overseeing. So it continued to create cyclical problems. Some prisons, and not West Virginia, thankfully, have different policies on how women are treated while incarcerated and if they have access to tampons and pads and other feminine hygiene products, if they have access to mental health care, and then for pregnant moms, whether or not they're shackled while giving birth. Now, I said that West Virginia is not in that category because we do not require mothers to be shackled while giving birth. And in fact, the mothers are able to stay with their children for several weeks afterwards and have visits with their children when they're in prison for several weeks afterwards. But that's not true for every prison and every woman's experience. So if you're working with a woman who's had an incarceration history and has given birth while in prison, that experience is something important to talk about. So this is a more dated chart, but this is again the most recent data that we have on women's incarceration by offense types. And it always strikes me that the highest offense type for women is violent crimes, because we tend not to think about women as engaging in or being involved in violent offenses. Right behind that is drug offenses, and then behind that is property offenses. Public order crimes are things that are maybe nuisance crimes or get individuals in trouble without having any harm to the state or any harm to a victim itself. But I hope this surprises you as much as it does me, because I still struggle with this statistic when I'm looking at why women are incarcerated and what kinds of offenses incarcerate women. So we're going to look at why some of these reasons exist and what causes some women to be incarcerated. And this is a quote from the Women Beyond Bars project that WVU did a few years ago. And it is the perspective of a woman who became involved in the criminal legal system because she submitted false documents to the IRS. It was out of scarcity, trying to get by, trying to get out of poverty, that she was submitting these documents. And then eventually she started using substances, struggled with addiction, and that all led to and snowballed into her experience with incarceration. So her story I highlight because it's not that unusual. A lot of times individuals get involved in the criminal legal system out of scarcity, out of survival behaviors. There was a study that looked at women who were in prison versus jails, and they found that overall they met the criteria for substance use, and there were high degrees of adverse childhood experiences and substance use correlated with criminal legal involvement for women in particular. And a lot of women are entering the criminal legal system in poverty, as a result of poverty, as a result of survival behaviors that they're trying to engage in to get themselves out of poverty or to take care of their children, to help them be fed and taken care of and have a roof over their head. We talked about violent crimes, that 38%, and oftentimes those violent crimes are results of self-defense against an intimate partner, or sometimes there are dual arrest laws where if there is intimate partner violence or a domestic violence call and the police come out, the police might say, we're just going to arrest everyone here. And so the woman goes to jail along with the other partner. And so when this happens, people just see that there is a violent crime on an individual's record, and that affects them getting housing, that affects them getting community benefits, that affects them getting employment. Sometimes that affects them getting any kind of upward mobility with regard to education or degrees or licenses or certifications, because that violent crime is a stigma that prevents them from advancing without any kind of context whatsoever. No context of intimate partner violence, no context of self-defense, no context of what happened that led to incarceration. So when I was at Lakin, our women's prison, a few years ago, I met a woman who was incarcerated for a violent crime. And it was exactly this situation. She was incarcerated because she was finally fighting back against her partner. And the partner died as a result. And she told me while we were meeting, I was there doing mindfulness meditation training with a nonprofit yoga group. And she said, I just want to learn as much as I can about trauma so I can help my kids back at home. Because she knew that her children, who were still back in the home and being raised by her family, had been traumatized from not just losing their parent to violence, but also losing their parent, their mom, who was incarcerated. And they had also witnessed all the intimate partner violence for years before the parent was killed. So these are individuals where we really have to understand and contextualize the experience and what happened, and not just look at what the crime on the paper is. 85% of incarcerated women have had some kind of sexual or physical violence in their life history. And that's important to remember, because if you're working with individuals who have any kind of criminal legal involvement, expect that they have some kind of sexual or physical violence in their history. 1 in 4 women have been raped before entering prison, and 90% or more of women convicted of murdering an intimate partner were abusive victims by that partner in their history. So it's that responsiveness where they're acting in a way to try to survive, not trying to do harm, but trying to survive, trying to keep themselves and their kids safe. So I do want to qualify that there are various kinds of violence that can occur, and these are just some of them. So we need to be very clear to use a woman's language and her terminology when we're talking to her about violence or abuse. Don't make assumptions. Get the information, get the story, get the background and get the context of what she's saying, and then use her words and her descriptions. Don't make leaps, don't make judgments, don't make assumptions. When we are working with women who are talking about their abuse history, we want to ask in narrative form from them, or have them describe in story form what happened to them and what meaning it has to them. A lot of times, individuals will talk about their first sexual experience, and they may not term it as rape. They may not describe it as rape. They may not describe it as incest. So talk to them about what that was like, what that experience was, what that story is to them, and how they make meaning out of it. Don't rescue folks while you're listening to them. That's not helpful to them. That's not helpful to their story. You want to hear the full story for what it is, and then avoid judgments like saying, why did you, or why didn't you? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you do this? Why did you stay? Why did you, make this choice? That's not helpful either in trying to understand the experience of the individual. So let's talk about some of the drivers. We've already alluded to some of them, that there are social drivers that really do lead to and drive criminal legal involvement for women in particular. And so when we're looking at any kind of assessment or treatment, we want to look at an understanding of those social drivers so that we can make sure women have those addressed so that they don't have re-entry into the criminal legal system. Some of the social drivers that we're going to talk about are poverty or scarcity, trauma and abuse, mental health concerns, substance use, and then that economic wage gap or educational attainment that oftentimes is lacking for women. So when we're interviewing or assessing women who have criminal legal involvement, we want to assess for all of these different things. Make sure that gender is specific and attended to, that we're creating safety, that we're informed about women's relational needs, no diversion opportunities, and if there are court requirements, and then making sure that we're addressing the needs of women in treatment. So women come into the criminal legal system along different pathways than men. That's already clear. And so we need to assess differently than we do for men. We also need to check our own biases and not be in a position where we think things happen in a certain way for all people that involve themselves or get involved in the criminal legal system, because it's just not true. That may be that you're taking the implicit association test. That may be that you're getting supervision and someone's giving you feedback on that. That may be that you're doing your own reading and research about the unique pathways of women and their involvement in the criminal legal system and some of the social drivers that women specifically experience. When you're interviewing a woman, especially a woman who has a history of trauma, that trauma may come out in the interview itself, and it can come out as impulsiveness. It may come out as someone who's argumentative or reactive. They've got these subcortical threat responses because they're already, on edge by being incarcerated or having just been released from incarceration. And so they're looking for threats in their environment, and how you're asking questions may come across to them in a very threatening way. There may be a lack of detailed memory because that's how trauma works. Trauma does not lay down linear memories and does not lay down details of what happened in a very structured linear way. There are gaps, there are missing pieces. And so it may seem that an individual is not being honest with you or not being forthcoming with you, but that's the way that trauma works. And then it may be that there are different stories than what the police report says. And that could be because of trauma, that could be because of other factors. But just remember when you're working with women that approaching their needs and understanding their needs and hearing their stories and interviewing them and assessing them really does take a gender responsive approach. We want to make sure that we're concurrently addressing the client's trauma while also guarding against our own vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress, because that can come up, especially when you hear some of these stories of women's experiences, both before incarceration, during incarceration, and after incarceration. So talk with them intentionally, be present. You can be empathic without diving in and having that empathic resonance. You have to have a separation, but you can still be compassionate. Make sure that you're asking questions with sensitivity in mind, making sure that the individual feel safe when you're talking to them, rather than peppering them with questions, and making sure that you're taking pauses and okay with silence and waiting for the responses. And there are 3 stages for interviewing a woman in a trauma-informed way. And that's the pre-stage, which is getting the background, looking at the history, trying to figure out what some of those social drivers are, what some of those history episodes of abuse might be, what some of those episodes of violence might be. So that's the pre. And then you're going to move from pre into the during interview by trying to engage the individual and observing her and trying to get a rapport built with her, but also creating safety, giving her choice, being very forthcoming about what you're doing while you're writing something, what's going to happen with that information, where it's going to go, giving her choices to press pause on the discussion, or maybe come back to a question at another time, giving her autonomy and respect while you're going forward. And then the post-interview is making sure that you end well. If you will prepare the woman and give enough time to prepare the woman for going back to wherever she's going, then that's the post-interview plan. And that means that you're going to ensure that she has all of her faculties about her, that she feels safe and secure, that she knows how to reach you, she knows what's going to happen next, that she feels safe leaving the interview. And we'll talk about some grounding techniques to make sure that you have that in mind as the woman's leaving the interview at the post-interview stage. Other things that you can do is make sure you collaborate with the individual, make sure that you practice controlled empathy, set aside your value judgments, demonstrate that you are worthy of trust, don't demand it, be curious and inquisitive, but don't be someone who's going to go in peppering with questions or be so inquisitive that you're determined to get the answer. Give space, allow for silence, know your biases, set aside value judgments. If something comes to mind and you think, why didn't you, or you should have, keep your mouth shut, because that can be triggering for someone who's already experiencing a lot of shame and a lot of self-doubt. When you're trying to ensure that there's environmental safety and that there's safety in the interview relationship also, then you're going to make sure that the individual woman is describing her home environment, describing who's there, describing who comes in, describing what that looks like. Is that a safe situation? What does safe look like? What does safe mean? And then also making sure during the interview that you're establishing safety. So that comes from rapport building. That comes from making sure the woman knows that she can pause, she can stop, she can take breaks, create a cue word so that when she uses that cue word, that means stop, or that means let's go to a different question. And you can always come back later, but giving her the respect and the autonomy to engage that safety is really important, because a lot of times individuals that have been traumatized don't have the power to take back safety. They're constantly under threat, under stress, under risk of harm. Check with women about who's important in their life, who in their relationship is safe for them, who in their relationship is supportive of them, who in their relationship is important to them. If they have children, are they the primary caregivers? Are there systems involved in the woman's life? Are some of the survival behaviors that brought the woman into the criminal legal system related to caregiving for the children or caregiving for family members? Was there trauma or violence in the home that affected not just the woman, but also the children or other individuals in the home? Make sure that you're asking these questions and also creating a plan for safety, so that not only the individual client, but her children are in a posture of being safe and secure and not under threat. Women can often be involved in diversion opportunities, and that really is meaningful, because if we're seeing West Virginia as number 10 in the nation for incarcerating women, we need to try to return women with structure, support, and accountability back to the community, so they can have their social drivers met, they can receive treatment without incarceration, and they can be reunited with their family. We have the LEAD, which is the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program. That is something where law enforcement can divert women into treatment rather than into jail. We have pretrial opportunities where the attorneys, whether it's the defense attorney or the prosecuting attorney, can recommend that a woman go into treatment. And if they're successful in treatment, whatever that treatment looks like, then they may have a lesser sentence imposed on them, or they may avoid jail time altogether. And then there are treatment courts. Drug courts, family treatment courts are great opportunities for women to get the treatment that they need, that they deserve, and also be supported while they're in the community. Overall, engaging women in treatment, it reduces relapse, and it also reduces recidivism, which is reoffending and returning to the community or into the prison community. If you are working with court-ordered women, make sure that you read the court orders thoroughly, know what you're supposed to report, when you're supposed to report, how you're supposed to report, and who gets that report. Because it is certainly not a safe situation when someone on the treatment side of things is expected and ordered to do something by the court and then doesn't, and the woman gets in trouble as a result of it. So make sure that you're aware of what those court orders say and what your obligations are for reporting to whom and what's supposed to be reported when. If you have any questions about that, then reach back out to the woman's attorney. Make sure that the attorney provides you whatever information you need to set you, your treatment program, and the individual client up for success. And then be transparent with your individual client. Tell her what it is that you're required to report, when you're required to report, what kinds of reports you have to send, whether it's a progress update, whether it's drug testing, whether it's how successful the visitations were with a woman's children during supervised visitations at the treatment site. You know, whatever it is, make sure that you're transparent, because again, that bakes in safety to the relationship, because you're being transparent, you're being honest, you're being forthright, and the woman knows what to expect. So there's predictability on her end. Be clear about what expectations and requirements that you know of, so that the woman knows what to expect also. Again, it's that dependability, that reliability, making sure that there is an understanding. Oftentimes when someone's gone through a really stressful, traumatic experience, comprehension is the first thing to go. So there's a lot of agreeableness, but not a lot of retention of information. So make sure that you're asking the individual woman that you're working with, hey, you know, tell me what you heard me say. Tell me what you heard the plan to be in your own words, so that she can give narrative feedback about what she heard and what she comprehended. Also investigate for strengths. You know, this is a really good way to build rapport and build relationships, but it's also a really nice way to circle back and do the post-interview preparation. Once you know the woman's strengths, what you know she likes to do for fun, what's important to her, what's meaningful to her, what she's good at, come back to that so that she can be prepared to be buoyed at the end of what's probably going to be a tough interview and tough assessment. These are some of the different areas of assessment that are important to do when you're working with a woman, especially a woman that is criminal legal involved. I want to highlight that history of head injury is really profound for women in particular, but all individuals who have criminal legal involvement. There's a high percentage, and not a direct correlation, but a related correlation between individuals that are involved in the criminal legal system with a past history of head injury. That can affect comprehension too. So be sure that you're asking about head injury and TBI history. These are some additional assessment tools that are really useful for working with women in particular. One's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. I like to pair that with the Resilience Questionnaire because that gives me some built-in strengths assessment. The General Self-Efficacy Scale is really kind of a nice thing to, again, reinforce a woman's strengths, because if they believe they can achieve their goals and they score high on this, then you can reinforce how well they are able to move towards their goals and accomplish their goals and achieve their goals. The trauma symptom checklist makes sense because If we have over 80% of women with a trauma history in the criminal legal system, then that's going to bear it out. And then the recovery capital scale, and there are various forms of this. This is the one by Granfield and Cloud, but this looks at the strengths and resources to engage in sustained recovery from substances. And I just think it's so empowering to be able to look at this and say, these are your goals. Look at what you've got at your disposal to support your recovery. Let's move you towards sustained recovery and get you started on that path. And I've mentioned ending well, and this is really important to me because you want to have enough time at the end of the assessment to check back in with the client, to make sure that she feels safe. If she doesn't feel safe, then you want to back up and figure out what it is that she needs to have in place to feel safe. Then reinforce her safety, reflect on her strengths, offer grounding techniques, and then talk about the next steps. What's going to happen next? What's the timeline going to be like? Does she have questions? Who's going to get information about this interview? Where does it go? What happens as a result of it? If there's anything that she needs to have done, see if that's achievable. See if that's something that you can accomplish or you need to refer it out. But make sure that the woman is feeling settled at the end of the interview, because you don't want to leave someone at the end of the interview feeling really raw and vulnerable and exposed. You want to make sure that she's feeling like her strengths are at the forefront, that her plan for action is at the forefront, and that she's safe. When I reinforce client safety at the end of an interview, I check in with, how are you doing? Tell me what's going on for you right now. How's your body feeling? I want her to get in touch with her body. And where is she feeling sensations in her body? Is she present with me in the room, or is she having some slight experiences of dissociation? Let's bring her back to the room and make sure that she can be safe. What are her questions? What are her concerns? What are her goals? How is that going to be woven into the plan that we come up with together? Who does she have as a contact for the court system, for the legal system, for treatment, for anyone else that's a system involved in her world? And then is there anything else that needs to be addressed? Anything that maybe the assessment brought up that caused her to feel raw or caused her to kind of think about things in a different way that she wants to talk about? And then process that with her. Just be present and listen, and make sure that at the end of your meeting, you have the ability to, in confidence, to make sure that she's okay. And that may be because you're sitting with her and listening to her more, or maybe you're just sitting in silence, or maybe you're practicing some grounding techniques. So I'm going to go back in a second, but these are some of the grounding techniques that you have at the end of your slides that Sarah's going to send out. These are very basic. And what I like about these in particular is you can do them while incarcerated. You can do them in an office. You can give these as homework for the woman that you're working with, and she can do it, anywhere she goes. She can take this with her. So I like these particular grounding techniques, and I might pick a couple that I'm going to use when I'm working with a woman who's got a criminal legal history. And if she practices them on her own, I'm going to check back in with her at the next interview and see how she's doing with it. One of my favorites is the calm, safe space and the Q word. This is taken from resourcing and EMDR, but the Q word is something that she can particularly take and use and practice on her own. And then you can follow up and check back with her, because as we all know about trauma histories, they're not contained. They come out in all sorts of ways and all sorts of times. And so if you're meeting with your client in the future, you can come back and check in with her about, okay, well, how have you been using your Q word? How is your calm, safe space being practiced? How is that going for you? So this is my contact information, and I think we may have at least one question in the chat. Let me see if there are any others, and I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. I got a Zoom bot question. That's interesting. So do you all work with women in the criminal legal system? Is that something that, is this your population? And I'm going to put my contact information in the chat. But is this a group that you work with?
Yes, it is.
What are some of the biggest challenges that you experience when working with criminal legal involved women?
I can tell you, we have women from all over the state come into our program. And the biggest struggle is every court system handles things very differently. And it's very hard to go from one county to the next until you have been there and spent some time there, because what's acceptable in one area of the state is highly unacceptable in another.
Absolutely. Anyone else echo that? That's been my experience too. What I would relate to that scenario is something that I learned early on before I received substance use treatment training. I was going into the Atlanta Fulton County Jail, and I was interviewing individuals who were charged with felony offenses, and they were telling me about their drug history. And I was like, oh yeah, I totally get it. You know, Black Beauties and Yellow Jackets, and yeah, I got it. And that's, that's an upper, and that's, that's get you going. And finally I had a client who very gracefully and so importantly told me, you have no idea what I'm talking about. And I was like, you're right. I don't. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm trying to riff off of your answers. And they said, yeah, ask questions. I will tell you anything you want to know, just ask questions. And so that's how I relate that to the court systems as a system itself operate very differently. Even our drug courts and our family treatment courts operate differently. But I talk to the women about their experience to try to figure out what that looks like so I can have some predictability. And I also counter that with, this is not predictable. This is not something that we don't have a crystal ball. We can't see into someone's mind. We don't know what is going to be the outcome in the future. So let's put a plan in place and see if you're comfortable with that plan. And then we'll circle back and reevaluate as we need. But it can be very, it can feel really exposed and vulnerable for folks when they don't feel like they have any agency in their court outcome because it is so unpredictable. And I think that's probably true for the providers, right?
That's huge. You want to talk about secondary trauma? If you have advocates going in with them and the end result is not what you're used to, and they may be being dragged back to jail for something that they had no control over, and you're standing there helpless, like, oh my God, what just happened? And I wasn't able to impact a change or a difference or an outcome. Mm-hmm. That's part's tough too.
It is. And it's secondary trauma. It's moral injury, because no matter how much work you put into it, no matter how much skill you put into it, the outcome is against your morals. It's against your value system. And you're working in a way that's aligned with your value system, and you're working in a way that's aligned with your morals, but a system is shifting that. And so that's the quickest way to burnout. That's the pathway to moral injury is vicarious trauma, and it results in burnout. And so trying to figure out ways, if we have the energy and the time, to advocate for the greater good outside of that individual client, but system-wide changes. Not easy. I know that's not easy, but that's one of the pathways of addressing moral injury.
Not really like a question, but more of like a comment to like the reasons why women are incarcerated, especially when it comes to violence. I did the Inside Out Prison Exchange program when I was an undergrad at WVU. And it was shocking that over half of the women that were in that class, they were just there because they finally decided to stand up and fight back for themselves in a domestic situation, and it just ended badly for them. So I think that's like really sad.
Yeah. And it's still, and I'm not minimizing this, it's still a death, right? But just like the woman I met at Lakin, she fought back and she's in prison for the rest of her life. And she's worried about her children because they have to deal with that trauma without their mom and without their dad.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the fighting back. And that's why I'm always astounded by nationwide how many women are charged in violent crimes. But then you kind of peel that back and realize, 90% of women nationwide that are charged in violent crimes have been victims of intimate partner violence and are harming or killing the offender of that intimate partner violence.
And I think it kind of speaks to like the volume of like needing more resources when it comes to domestic violence partnerships, because I feel like if we had more resources, that we wouldn't have this many females ending up in prisons and
Yep.
having to go through all this trauma, and also with the children as well.
Absolutely. And knowing that women are held to higher standards than mothers are held to higher standards than fathers, then we are looking at an exacerbating foster care situation just by virtue of women being incarcerated.
Stephanie, there's a question in the chat saying, do you run into much manipulation or deceitfulness from clients in prison environments in attempting to help them?
So I've done this for about 20 years. I've worked in and around lawyers and criminal legal settings for about that long. And so I've gone into a lot of jails and a lot of prisons, and I've learned so much. And I have learned at base of that while that's an amazing question, I have to reframe the approach of what an individual is bringing when they see me. There's a power dynamic when I'm walking into an interview in jail or prison, because I can walk back out. I can come in with a normal pen and paper, and I get to go home at the end of the day and the end of the interview. Some of the things that I've learned from women in particular who are trying to survive in jail and prison, one lesson, and this, I'm trying to speak to this, so thanks for your patience, but one lesson I learned was, if you get like a brownie or a cookie on your food tray, save that, because the last meal at the end of the day is served about 4 or 4:30 in jail. And your next meal is not going to be until about 8 or 8:30 the next day. And so that brownie, if you put it away, you can eat it later on when you're hungry. Because while that may seem like someone's hoarding food or they're being deceptive, they're trying to survive from being hungry. And so I take that and I kind of expand it out and realize there's a lot of trade and there's a lot of unusual commerce that's happening in the jail and prison system. And some of it is for survival, some of it is for necessity, some of it is for power, some of it is for safety. And that is a way of operating to get by. And that's why I give you that example of the brownie. Is I would have never thought about it, but I will always think about it now. Like, for some reason, if I were to end up incarcerated, that is my go-to memory of, okay, I'm going to have to keep my brownie. And so folks operate and interact with me sometimes out of their survival mechanisms, and it can come across as deception. It can come across and feel like manipulation, but clinically it's our responsibility to get to the root of that and figure out what is the goal? What is the desire? What is the strategy here? And why is that strategy being used? Because if it's hoarding food, which in prison, that's a violation. You can get written up for that. I had a client who had an apple in her cell in prison because she got hungry. It's an apple. And when they did a cell search of her cell block, she got written up for it. And I'm like, it's an apple. She's hungry. But that's their rules. And so is that a violation of the rules? Is that deceptive? Yes. Is it for harmful reasons or to do harm to someone else or to manipulate someone else? No. So I hope that answers that question. That's how I try to look at that is, yeah, there is manipulation and deception in the jail and prison environment, but to what end and for what cause, I think it's our responsibility to scale back and look at that. It's not, I don't see a lot of antisocial folks. I just really don't. I see folks that really do operate out of those survival behaviors. Any other questions?
Just as a reminder to everyone, I did put the evaluation survey link, so if you could all please fill that out. If you're still thinking of questions, there is a comment saying excellent presentation, thanking you.
Thank you.
And yes, thank you for your presentation, Stephanie.
Thank you. I will say the one global takeaway that I hope you all have from this is there is a great likelihood that if you're working with women, particularly if you're working with women who have a substance use history, women who have a trauma history, then they are likely to have a history of criminal legal involvement, whether they were incarcerated or not. They may have had police contact, they may have been detained, they may have been in juvenile detention. That propensity rises when you're working with women. And this population in particular deserves our best efforts to make sure that we're assessing them with a gender responsive, trauma-informed assessment, that we are making sure that safety in their environment and relational needs are at the forefront, and that we are being upfront with them about the process, being transparent about that process, and that we're taking care of ourselves